So welcome to TAS Film and TV. So this is my review of Narrow Road to the Deep North, which has recently aired on the BBC here in the UK. So I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account of the plot, but there are going to be loose spoilers in this review. So if you haven't watched it yet and don't want it spoiled, then it might be best to watch it and then come back here later. So Narrow Road to the Deep North is a 5-part TV drama miniseries which is based on Richard Flanagan's 2014 novel of the same name. Now, I haven't read the source material yet, but it's definitely on my list now after watching this. And the story follows the life of Australian surgeon Dorigo Evans across 3 time periods. So it encompasses his life in the pre-World War II period in which he has a love affair with his uncle's wife. And then we move to his harrowing experiences as a prisoner of war on the brutal Burma Railway. And then latterly we see his sort of complex aftermath as a reluctant war hero and surgeon. And the story uses those 3 timelines to explore the enduring impact of his experiences. And it contrasts and moves between moments of sort of intense love and humanity with the absolutely horrific cruelty and trauma that he experiences in captivity, and between his sort of joyless, almost lifeless existence as an older man. And now the series is directed by Justin Kurzel, and his credits include the acclaimed Australian films Snowtown and Night Tram, as well as the Ned Kelly biopic True History of the Kelly Gang. And the cast includes Jacob Elordi, who plays the young Dorigo, Ciaran Hinds, who plays the older Dorigo, and Odessa Young, who plays Dorigo's young love, Amy. So I just want to say straight off the bat that I absolutely loved this series, and it deeply moved me and had a profound impact on me. So at its heart, this is just a brilliant character study of the long-term impact of torture and trauma. And I wouldn't usually do this, but to share a personal experience. So in my day job, I'm a social worker, and I worked with victims of torture for a while. And one guy I met, he'd been tortured in a foreign prison. And we got talking about his life, and I asked him what the impact of those experiences were on his life and how it affected him now, because my job was to support him with his difficulties now. And he just went very quiet, and he said, "They stole my innocence." And that is exactly what this series captures in masterful detail, in my opinion. And for me, one of its biggest successes is that it relies on the principle of show, don't tell. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So in the pre-war scenes, we see Dorigo go to stay with his uncle Keith prior to being shipped out to war. And he starts a forbidden relationship with Keith's wife, Amy. Now, the love affair between Dorigo and Amy is just captured perfectly. The passion, the newness, the raw love between them, it just jumps off the screen. And every scene just picks up their strong emotions for one another, as they pull each other close while they're in the water, for example, or Dorigo kissing the inside of Amy's leg, or a stolen glance across the pub that they live in together. And the aim is quite clearly to show us that Dorigo is a young man, he's full of hope, he's full of love, and he's got dreams and desires. And the filmmaking and the cinematography supports that. We get sunny scenes on the beach, we get the light reflecting off the surf, close-ups of them embracing and making love. And there's almost a sepia-toned sort of hue to that whole period in Dorigo's life. But that passion, that sort of fire that drives him and which jumps off the screen so clearly in those pre-war scenes, is then contrasted with cuts forward to Dorigo in probably his late 50s or maybe early 60s. And there's an overall sort of beige tone to everything. Dorigo, he wears a suit, he lives in some sort of postmodern, dead tech, grey house without any soul or feeling. And he goes into his job as a surgeon in this corporate sort of grey, bland environment. He goes to meetings with other boring, bland hospital executives. And we don't see any passion or even any feeling really. When he has conversations with his wife Ella, they're just talking about what they've built, as in their possessions, their house. There's no sense of any feeling at all. It's just a sort of functional existence for Dorigo almost. And the contrast between the 2 timelines is striking for that very reason. And so across the series, we jump back and forth in time between those 2 worlds. And what I really love about that is that we don't see older Dorigo, sitting in a therapist's chair saying, "Oh, this is how I feel, this is what's wrong with me." We see in his actions and in his relationships what is wrong, and we see through the colour palette and the greyness what is wrong. And ultimately that's down to the strength of the source material, but it's also down to the expert direction, the screenplay and the cinematography. And that's what I meant when I said show, don't tell. The director and his team, they've shown us how Dorigo's life has changed as a result of his experiences. And then that brings me to the other sort of standout bit in this series, which is the depictions of life in the jungle. Yeah, and we see over the episodes that Dorigo and the other POWs, they're just existing day to day in that sort of impenetrable jungle. And what I loved about it was that it's just such an unvarnished portrayal of life in a POW camp. I don't think there's any caricatures here. We just see the monotony of day-to-day life, the grinding hunger, the rampant disease. And we also just see the bureaucratic sort of incompetence and bureaucratic malice of the Japanese soldiers. For me, there weren't sort of simple portraits of good or evil here that you might get in other war films or TV shows. There's just this sort of unrelenting greyness and futility to everything that happens. It's just sort of chain of command, self-loathing, and a bureaucratic hierarchy of hatred and incompetence. And what I also loved about the jungle scenes was just the colour palette. We were in a tropical jungle here, but the leaf cover and the fauna create this sort of grey, dank atmosphere, and it just perfectly matches what we're seeing from the characters on screen. And as I said, there's just this unvarnished, raw quality to it all. And there's two scenes in the jungle in particular which just left me feeling bereft. So in the first, Dorigo, he has to perform an emergency operation on one of the other prisoners. So he's got no equipment to speak of, there's no way of dulling the other prisoner's pain. And we see it all, we hear it all, and it's just deeply affecting TV. And then I thought it wouldn't be possible to get much more harrowing and raw than that. But then in episode 4, we see a scene of such sort of, just unrelenting brutality that I was actually left in tears at the end of it. And I don't want to give too much away, and there's no need to really. It's just a scene of torture that left me feeling completely bereft and sort of devoid of any hope at the end of the episode. And this is again where I wanted to go back to pick up on how this show depicts the long-term impact of torture and trauma on a person. When you've experienced and survived torture, there are numerous symptoms that might arise immediately, but then which also tend to stick around for months and even years afterwards. And these include, sort of a loss of hope and joy in life, really strong negative emotions such as anger or nihilism, impulsivity or recklessness, the need to seek out experiences to make you feel alive or just to feel anything really, challenges and difficulties in personal relationships, and just that sense of being outwardly normal to other people, but then feeling dead inside. And older Dorigo and how his character's painted on the screen, they just capture that perfectly. Ciaran Hinds gets it spot on. And the writing is also just absolutely brilliant in capturing that. And I talked earlier about older Dorigo's sort of grey existence, but we also see that sense of nihilism and recklessness. And that's perhaps seen through, an illicit affair, or perhaps when Dorigo performs a risky medical procedure at work. And we also see snippets of anger from him. So, for example, when he's being interviewed by a young journalist who happens to say the wrong thing. And as the series draws to a close, we really get to the heart of it all, because we get a scene where he's reflecting on the futility of war, and we see that feeling of hopelessness that lives inside him. So again, Ciaran Hinds' performance is just brilliant and is matched by the directing and the cinematography, because as he's giving those reflections, we get cutaways back to the jungle, in which we see that the railway line in which he and his fellow prisoners were working on has become overgrown, and the railway line itself is disused. So we're left asking the question, what was the point of it all? And in summary, good film and TV is about engendering emotions in your audience and about creating believable worlds that resonate with an audience. And this programme ticks every single box, in my opinion. I absolutely loved it, and it's just a triumph on all fronts as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not sure if Justin Kurzel intended this, but I also think it's a really important story to tell now, because, every day on the news or in our timelines, we're assaulted with imagery of sort of dead children, of war, and we get that sort of loss of hope that comes from seeing depictions of war. But when I think back to the scenes of young Dorigo, I'm reminded that as humans we are capable of passion, love, and that sense of futility and pointlessness isn't a given. So yeah, overall I think this is an absolute triumph. It's a painful, harrowing triumph, and I'd highly recommend you to watch it. But yeah, if you've seen it, please let me know in the comments, what were your thoughts on the series? What were your takeaways from the series as a whole? Yeah, many thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.